Shabbat Shalom. Several years ago, I was at the home of friends of mine. And after dinner, I stayed while they put their toddler to bed. They had a whole involved routine, including songs, books, and more. As my friends were singing songs to their child, some of which were unfamiliar to me, one of them turned and asked me, "What songs did your parents sing to you when you were a child?" I drew a blank. I knew that they had sung many songs to me, and as I got older, we sang many songs together, and in the moment, I couldn't think of a single one. Well, fast forward a few years later, I have my own child, and it amazes me how many songs have been popping into my head all the time. Songs that I haven't heard or sung or even thought of in many years. Something about hearing and singing some children's songs has just opened up the part of my mind that I haven't accessed in a long time. And I never know what thought or feeling or action might trigger a memory. And suddenly there I am, singing to my daughter a song that I didn't remember that I remembered. Many neuroscientists think that the storage capacity of our long-term memory is basically infinite. And before you jump in and ask how that can possibly be, well, one answer to that question is that while we may store an enormous amount of information, the challenging task for our brains is to access those memories. The more often we attempt to retrieve a memory, the easier it is to find that information the next time we want it. So once I started retrieving memories of childhood songs, the rest of them were suddenly easier to find. Today is Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat of memory, which is always the Shabbat immediately before Purim. Whatever parsha of the week we read on this day, we always read a special maftir portion from Deuteronomy that reminds us of the mitzvah to remember what Amalek did to us, the nation that preyed on us when we traveled through the wilderness, the nation of which Haman, we are told in the Megillah, was a member. We're reminded always to remember, never to forget. We demonstrate our commitment to memory by reading a text that brings it to our consciousness. We consciously reinforce those neural pathways to make sure that we will always be able to find this story in our long-term memory. Now, obviously, our tradition considers this story to be important, but what is it about the idea of memory itself that leads us to name this Shabbat after it? Orit Avneri, an Israeli biblical scholar, wrote a fascinating article about the role of memory in the Purim story, and I'd like to share some of what she wrote. The word for remember in Hebrew, zachor, appears in 3 places in the Megillah. Once at the beginning, once in the middle, and once at the end. Each of those moments is a pivotal moment, a moment that helps determine the fate of the Jews. By examining these 3 appearances, we can learn a lot about memory. It first appears at the beginning of chapter 2. Sometime afterward, and that is after Ahasuerus had banished Vashti, sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And this memory leads to Ahasuerus deciding to find a new queen. He remembers Vashti and he's lonely. And he ultimately picks Esther, thus putting her in the situation where she will be able to save her people. Memory again occurs in the middle of the Megillah, in the pivotal scene of the book, chapter 6, when the king asks for the book of memories to be read to him to help put him to sleep. Unexpectedly, instead of putting him to sleep, those memories propel the king to action. When he learns that Mordechai was never rewarded for saving the king's life, Ahasuerus acts quickly to honor Mordecai, inadvertently beginning the process of subverting Haman's plans. And finally, memory occurs at the end in chapter 9, verse 28. Consequently, these days of Purim are remembered and observed in every generation by every family, every province, and every city, and the memory of them shall never perish among their descendants. So memory propels the story forward, and at the end, we remember the story. Memory is the key to each of these turning points in the Megillah. It's the key to the transformation of the story from a tragedy into a comedy. And it's the key that allows the king and Mordecai and Esther to each gain some agency and have control over the course of events. But what is it that allows memory to serve this role? Well, let's step back for a moment, because there's one kind of memory that is absent from the book. It's a memory that we might expect to be there, but it isn't. I'm talking about Jewish memory. Dr. Avneri points out that Jewish memory is virtually absent in the book. Although Mordecai and Esther identify as Jewish, they don't have particular markers of Jewish cultural or religious practice. We see it in their names. Mordecai's name recalls the god Marduk, and Esther's the goddess Ishtar. We see it in their food. In contrast to the book of Daniel, which explicitly tells us that when Daniel and his friends were in the palace of the king, they refused to eat non-kosher food. The book of Esther makes no mention of the food being any source of concern for Esther while she's in the palace. We see it in Esther's marriage. Whereas other biblical characters are extremely concerned that their children should marry within the Jewish community, nothing is mentioned here about any particular resistance or discomfort by anyone with the fact that Esther is marrying outside her faith. We see it in the lack of prayer. Usually in the Bible, when people fast, they fast and pray. But here, Esther fasts before she goes to the king, and she invites all of the Jews of Shushan to fast with her, but there's no mention of prayer. It's very different from the mention of fasting in other parts of the Bible. And we see it in the lack of mention of the land of Israel. Israel, or it's called Yehud, it would be called Yehud, was one of the provinces over which Ahasuerus reigned. And in fact, ironically, Ahasuerus is mentioned once in another book of the Bible, in Ezra and Nehemiah, and there it's in relation to the fact that he ruled over Yehud. But in the Megillah, which is all about Ahasuerus, we don't see Yehud mentioned at all. We also see it in the lack of holiday observances. It's easy for us to forget because it's not mentioned in the Megillah, but the date of Esther's fast, Pesach. And to top it all off, as many of us are familiar, mention of God is entirely absent from the Megillah. So explicit markers of Jewish memory and Jewish practice are missing. But on the other hand, there is under the surface a hidden layer of memory throughout the book. And Avneri she gives this huge list of parallels between the book of Esther and other parts of the Bible. I'm not going to mention them all, but I'll give you just a couple. The abduction of Esther among the other women and being brought to the palace has some parallels to stories about Sarah. In Genesis, there are 2 times that Sarah is abducted by foreign kings. Mordecai might remind us of Joseph. They both refuse to violate their principles. They both end up as viziers in a foreign court. And Esther and Moses actually have a number of parallels. They were both adopted. By the way, plug for my class on adoption in the Jewish in Jewish law. I'll be teaching on Sunday. They were both adopted. They were both brought into the household of a foreign king. They both saved the Israelites from an existential crisis. And both stories end with immense victories on their side and yearly festivals commemorating them. And those festivals happen to be exactly 1 month apart. So the book of Esther is a book of remembrances under the surface. And those allusions contrast sharply with the content, where there's only very sparse allusions to Jewish values, practices, and memory. So why? What is this story trying to show us about memory? Well, in all places where the word memory, or to remember, appears, the verb is juxtaposed with the verb lasot, to do. In the first place, Achashverosh remembered what was done to Vashti. But the action is described passively, almost as if he had nothing to do with it. The king almost doesn't see himself as having responsibility for his actions, and in fact, seems to mostly do whatever his advisors suggest. In the second case, the king is passive at the beginning. The book of remembrances is read to the king by his servants. Events are found to have been written in the book. And yet, once he hears about Mordecai saving him, the king says, "What honor or advancement has been done for Mordecai?" The servants tell him, "Nothing has been done for him." And so he acts. In the third instance, the days of Purim are remembered, Niskarim, and observed or fulfilled, Na'asim. And here's the quote: "Consequently, these days are remembered and observed in each generation by every family, province, and city. And these days of Purim shall never cease among the Jews, and the memory of them shall never perish among their descendants." How is it that memory doesn't disappear? Because things are done. The lesson is straightforward. Memory has the potential to lead to action. But in order for that action to have a positive impact, the person acting must be intentional, with consciousness of the consequences of their behavior. Throughout the Megillah, Mordecai and Esther remember that they are Jews. After all, Esther intentionally hides her Jewish name and identity. And the very reason that Haman wants to kill the Jews is because he knows that Mordecai is Jewish. But that memory of their Jewish identity generally doesn't lead them to act any differently from anyone else until the end. In setting up a yearly celebration to remember the story of Purim, Mordecai and Esther seem to recognize that memory and action need to be paired together in order to be effective. They therefore set up rituals for us to do every year to make sure we remember and that we act on those memories. Shabbat Zachor calls upon us to remember the existence of evil embodied in the character of Amalek and to do something about it. Memory impacts us whether we're conscious of it or not, but when we are, we're able to make decisions and to create a future that is different from the past. When we look at the world around us, many of us may fear seeing history repeat itself. Having those memories is important, but so is what we do about it. Shabbat Shalom.